Origin stories. In some ways, they are very crucial to understand the motivations behind any particular character that you want to learn about. We've seen the classic origin story told in the sense of Spider-Man with Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, where the whole movie was his origin story. We've seen unconventional origin stories where, in the case of, again, another Spider-Man, one could argue that Tom Holland's trilogy as a whole was his entire origin story, and so then moving forward, we're getting the true Spider-Man that we have been wanting to see on screen. But are origin stories always necessary? Welcome back, and if you're new here, welcome. On this channel, we talk about video games and comic books. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode like this. Also, quick shout out to our Patreon for behind the scenes access. So I'm gonna be straight up, I am tired of origin stories. Specifically origin stories for characters that for the most part we already know. We don't need another Superman origin story or another Batman origin story or even like an X-Men origin story. I mean, who needs to see Charles Xavier actually set up the school for mutants? Even take Fantastic Four. Who needs to see the Fantastic Four in the MCU actually get their powers and work together as a team? Now, I'm not saying that directors should just assume that anybody watching their movies already knows everything about these heroes and that we should just assume that we already know all this stuff, so now we're just moving past it to tell the story that we really want to tell. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is that we should actually take a beat from the original comic books themselves and tell a story that is interesting and inviting enough to warrant enough fans to want to then go back and tell the origin of how these heroes and or villains got to where they got to be. So I was rereading through the earliest and first appearances of Doctor Strange in Marvel Comics. And this isn't the only character that this has ever been done. It was pretty commonplace back then, but what I really enjoyed was we actually started off, and I wasn't expecting this because I had not read comics from that long ago. We actually started off not with an origin story, but with just a regular everyday adventure of Doctor Strange. So there was already Kamar-Taj, there was already the Ancient One, there was already Baron Mordo set up as the villain, the lost, failed student that wanted to defeat the Ancient One. We had already seen Doctor Strange as pretty much a master of the mystic arts, able to use spells and things like that. While he didn't look and function exactly the same as he would be today if you went into your local comic book store and picked up the newest issue of Doctor Strange, all of these powers and abilities were figured out along the way. And it wasn't until about 5 or so appearances or issues that Doctor Strange actually got his origin story told. And so what I found interesting about that is that they focused on primarily creating a character that would be appealing and interesting enough to the average comic book reader before they waste their time and tell an origin story. From a creative decision, it's a lot more interesting to just think of a character or a superhero or a villain and think of their abilities and their powers, their weaknesses, and just simply create them. Then create the backstory of how they got there later on. What's fascinating about that is that it is a much more interesting route to set up and establish your characters, and I would love to see that with more mainline heroes and villains in these upcoming movies. I mean, looking at the DC camp, how they introduced Aquaman, whether you liked Jason Momoa's Aquaman or not, I actually really enjoyed how they introduced that character as a whole. They didn't go the traditional MCU route of doing the origin stories and establishing that universe, then doing the team up, and whether you liked that approach of how DC did it differently or not, what I liked specifically with Aquaman is with the Justice League movie, they just had him in the movie, and they had his abilities, they didn't really hold your hand and explain to you what his abilities are, and then 2 years later, Aquaman came out, where it then told his origin story, but again in a little bit of an unconventional way because he already had his powers. So then we were learning about the history and the lore, and ultimately the origin movie for him was not only telling his background, but also in the present day, really getting him to rise to the throne and take on the mantle of being king of Atlantis. When I look back at Marvel movies, for instance, and I think of characters that I really enjoyed, or even their movies in particular, I really enjoyed the movies that weren't necessarily their origin stories. Hardly do I actually enjoy their origin stories so much as I like their sequels more. Take Captain America, for example. I love Captain America. I also love his origin story. I don't really like Captain America the First Avenger, however. Mainly because the whole time I was watching the movie, I was waiting for the end when we were going to be done with all of the stuff going on in the past, and he was really going to be in the present where all of the stuff ultimately matters. That's why I liked Captain America the Winter Soldier so much. I could go on and on about all the things that I love about that movie, but I will save that for another video. Be sure to subscribe so you can see that in the future. But one of my biggest things that I loved about that movie is we were done with the origin story. We were just getting a Captain America story. And the whole point of what I'm getting at with all of this is that I think that the traditional origin story is a little bit overdone at this point. Take comics, for instance. If you know the origin story of any hero, take Superman, for example. You can go into your local comic book shop and, for the most part, pick up any Superman book at any time, and you can kind of piece together what's going on. Sure, you might be in the middle of an event where he's facing off against Doomsday again, or he's facing off against Brainiac, and you're wondering, how did this confrontation start and where did all of this ensue? Yeah, you can then go back to the earlier issues to figure out when this specific event started. But for the most part, you can pick up that book and understand Superman's motivations, you can understand his powers, and you can understand ultimately what he is trying to achieve. And I think that that is ultimately where we need to get to with the movies, where we're able to just jump into a movie where, for the most part, the movies are sort of a snapshot of how that hero is with the current situation of what is going on. We're no longer dealing with the origin stories, we're no longer dealing with them exploring new things, and we're simply getting to see a movie of this hero interacting with other people. No need for any kind of additional setup. And if you want to go back and see how this hero got here, of where did they get their powers, how did they get their costume, then you can go back to their show and get to be able to see that. A real-world example of that going on right now is the Marvel's movie. If you're somebody that has never seen any of the MCU shows and you're only watching the Phase 4 and 5 movies, then you're going to wonder who the heck is Monica Rambeau and Kamala Khan standing right here next to Carol Danvers. But that's the beauty of the shows, because then you can go back and watch these shows to understand their backstories. And I'm sure to some extent the movie will probably have a throwaway comment or a slight mention, maybe even a very brief flashback of some kind where it's kind of showing a little bit of their origins or maybe explaining their powers or something like that. But for the most part, if you want to understand who this character is, you got to go back and watch the show. That makes the shows more important, but that also makes the shows a little bit unnecessary, which is a good thing, because then you're able to focus on the movies if that's what you want to focus on, and you can then go back to the shows if you decide to. But let me know what you think. Do you think that origin stories are overdone? Do you think that you're tired of seeing origin stories? Would you want to see an origin story of the new Superman and Batman in the new DCU? I'd love to have a conversation with you down below, and also let me know what are your favorite origin stories. Be sure to check out either one of these videos here, and if you've stuck around this long, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss another video like this. I will catch you in the next video. Peace.